There is a quiet assumption most people carry without ever questioning it. If someone is not posting their life, not sharing their face, not showing their wins, then something must be missing. Something must be wrong. Maybe they are insecure. Maybe they are hiding. And on the surface, that idea feels reasonable because we have been trained to associate visibility with value. But if you look a little closer, it starts to fall apart. Because what it actually reveals is not the truth about that person. It reveals the conditioning of a culture that is addicted to being seen, a culture where attention has quietly become a form of currency, where silence feels suspicious, and where absence gets mistaken for weakness. But here is the uncomfortable truth. There are people who do not show up constantly, not because they lack confidence, but because they no longer need to prove anything. And once you understand that, the way you interpret silence will never be the same again. Most people never consciously decide that attention equals value. They absorb it slowly, quietly, through repetition, through systems designed to reward visibility. And over time, that idea stops feeling like a belief and starts feeling like reality. Because everywhere you look, the pattern reinforces itself. The people who are seen the most appear the most important. The people who receive the most reactions appear the most confident. And the people who stay quiet begin to look like they are somehow falling behind. But this is where the distortion begins. Because attention is not the same thing as value. It is simply a signal, and like any signal, it can be manipulated, amplified, or completely disconnected from substance. Yet most people never question it. They adapt to it. They start measuring themselves against it. And without realizing it, they begin outsourcing their sense of worth to something that was never designed to define it in the first place. Hughes often points out that human behavior is heavily driven by reinforcement loops, and social media is one of the most efficient reinforcement systems ever created because it gives immediate feedback, immediate validation, and immediate comparison. You post something, you receive a response, and that response conditions your next action. Over time, this creates a subtle dependency, not always obvious, not always extreme, but consistent. And consistency is what rewires behavior. So even people who believe they are unaffected often find themselves checking, adjusting, curating, not necessarily because they want attention, but because they have been trained to respond to it. And once that loop is in place, it becomes very difficult to separate who you are from how you are perceived. The real problem is not that attention exists. The problem is that it has been mistaken for evidence, evidence of worth, evidence of success, evidence of identity, and once attention becomes evidence, it begins to shape decisions. People start choosing what to show based on what will be approved, not what is true. They begin to filter themselves through the imagined reactions of others. And that is where something important starts to erode. Because identity is no longer being expressed, it is being negotiated. And negotiation always comes with compromise, sometimes small, sometimes invisible, but always present. And over time, those compromises accumulate until a person is no longer entirely sure where the performance ends and the self begins. You can see this most clearly in how people react to silence. When someone is consistently visible and then suddenly becomes quiet, others start asking questions, not out of curiosity, but out of discomfort, because silence disrupts the pattern. It removes the signal people have learned to rely on And without that signal, they do not know how to interpret the person anymore. So they default to assumption, maybe something is wrong, maybe they are struggling, maybe they lost confidence, because in a system where visibility equals value, the absence of visibility must mean the absence of value. Even though that conclusion is fundamentally flawed, what makes this even more complex is that the system rewards the illusion of stability, not the reality of it. A person can appear confident, successful, and fulfilled simply by maintaining consistent visibility, while someone who is grounded, self-assured, and internally stable may appear invisible, and therefore insignificant, if they choose not to participate in the display. And this inversion is where many people get lost, because they begin chasing signals instead of substance. They optimize for reaction instead of meaning, and without realizing it, they start building an identity that depends on being seen rather than an identity that exists regardless of who is watching. Empaths, especially those who are highly self-aware, tend to notice this distortion earlier than most, not because they are superior, but because they are more sensitive to the emotional undercurrents behind behavior. They can feel when something is being performed. They can sense when approval is being sought, and they can recognize how quickly external validation can begin to influence internal state. And once you see that clearly, it becomes difficult to fully participate in it without questioning it. Because you realize that if your confidence rises when people notice you and falls when they do not, then your confidence was never entirely yours to begin with. This is why many empaths start to pull back, not dramatically, not as a rejection of connection, but as a subtle refusal to let attention define them. They begin to separate expression from validation. They might still share, but they no longer rely on the response. They might still be visible, but they are no longer attached to being seen. And this shift is quiet, often invisible to others. But internally, it is significant because it marks the moment when a person stops asking the world to confirm their value and starts defining it for themselves. And this is the part most people misunderstand. Stepping away from constant visibility is not always a sign of insecurity. Sometimes it is the opposite. It is the result of recognizing that attention is a tool, not a measure, that visibility is an option, not a requirement, and that value, real value, does not increase just because more people are looking at it. And once that realization becomes clear, the entire system loses its grip because you are no longer participating in it unconsciously. You are choosing when and how to engage. And that choice is where psychological independence begins. Most people scroll past a post and see exactly what is presented: a photo, a caption, a moment, something simple, something surface level. But empaths rarely experience it that way, because they are not just looking at the content, they are sensing the intention behind it, the emotional current underneath it, the subtle exchange that is happening between the person posting and the people responding. And once you become aware of that layer, it is very difficult to ignore it, because what looks casual on the outside often carries something much deeper on the inside. A quiet request to be seen, to be validated, to be affirmed in ways that are rarely spoken out loud. This is not about judging people who share their lives. It is about recognizing that every act of self-presentation carries an element of signaling, and signaling always has a purpose. Sometimes it is connection, sometimes it is expression, but very often it is reassurance. And empaths tend to pick up on that distinction almost immediately. They can feel when something is being offered freely versus when something is being offered in exchange for a reaction. And that difference, while subtle, changes the entire experience of engaging with it because now it is no longer just a post. It is a transaction. And transactions, even emotional ones, come with weight. Chase Hughes often emphasizes that behavior is rarely random. It is driven by needs, patterns, and learned responses. And when you apply that lens to social media, a lot of what people consider normal begins to look different. You start to see patterns of approval seeking, identity reinforcement, and even mild forms of social bargaining, where a person is not just sharing who they are negotiating how they want to be perceived, adjusting tone, image, and timing based on what will produce the most favorable response. And while most people participate in this unconsciously, empaths tend to notice it consciously, and that awareness creates a kind of distance. It is not that empaths believe posting is wrong. It is that they become aware of how easily identity can get entangled with reaction, how quickly a person can begin shaping themselves around feedback, and how subtle that shift can be. Because it does not happen all at once. It happens gradually. A slightly different caption here. A more appealing image there. A decision not to share something that might not be well received. And, over time, these small adjustments accumulate into a version of self that is optimized for approval. And once that happens, expression is no longer entirely authentic. It is partially strategic. For someone who is highly sensitive to authenticity, that can feel exhausting. Not because they are above it, but because they can feel the tension inside it. The split between what is real and what is being presented, and maintaining that split requires energy. It requires constant awareness of how something will be interpreted, constant anticipation of response, and constant adjustment based on feedback. And, for many empaths, that process drains more than it gives, because instead of feeling connected, they feel like they are participating in a system where connection is filtered through performance. This is where a key distinction begins to form. Empaths are not rejecting interaction. They are rejecting dependency. They are not avoiding being seen. They are avoiding the need to be validated, and those two things may look identical from the outside. But internally, they are completely different experiences. One comes from fear. The other comes from awareness. And awareness changes behavior in subtle but powerful ways. It makes a person more selective about what they share, more intentional about when they engage, and more detached from the outcome of how it is received. Another layer that empaths often perceive is how reactions themselves are not neutral. A like is not just a like. A comment is not just a comment. Each response carries its own projection, its own interpretation, its own emotional and once something is shared publicly, it becomes subject to all of those interpretations simultaneously. Admiration, comparison, envy, misunderstanding, even silent judgment. And while most people can ignore or filter this out, empaths tend to feel it more directly, as if the post does not just exist on a screen, but exists inside a field of other people's perceptions. And that can become overwhelming over time. Because of this, many empaths begin to step back, not dramatically, not as a statement, but as a natural response to what they are perceiving. They start to question whether the exchange is worth the cost, whether the validation gained is equal to the energy spent, and whether constantly placing parts of themselves into that system is something they actually want to continue doing. And for many of them, the answer becomes no. Not because they do not value connection, but because they begin to value something else more, a sense of self that is not constantly shaped by external reaction. And this is where most people misunderstand them. They see less posting and assume disengagement. They see less visibility and assume withdrawal. But what they are often witnessing is a shift in how a person relates to attention itself, a movement away from unconscious participation toward conscious choice. And that shift is quiet. It does not announce itself, it simply changes behavior. It changes priorities. And over time, it changes identity. Because once you stop engaging in every available exchange, you begin to realize that not every interaction is necessary. Not every audience is relevant. And not every form of visibility is worth the cost of being interpreted by people who do not truly understand you. One of the most important distinctions most people never make is the difference between wanting to be seen and needing to be validated. And until you separate those two, it is almost impossible to understand why some people choose not to constantly show themselves, because from the outside it all looks the same. Visibility, attention, recognition. But internally, these are very different experiences. One comes from expression. The other comes from dependence. And dependence always comes with a cost, even if that cost is subtle at first. When a person begins to rely on external reaction to feel secure in who they are, something shifts. Their sense of identity starts to move outside of them. It becomes partially owned by the people observing them, and this is what Hughes often refers to when he talks about behavioral conditioning, because once a behavior is tied to a reward, especially a social or emotional reward, the brain begins to prioritize that behavior, not because it is meaningful, but because it is reinforced. And over time, that reinforcement can become so normalized that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like a necessity. This is where the distortion becomes dangerous. Because if your confidence rises when people notice you and drops when they do not, then your confidence is no longer stable. It is reactive. It fluctuates based on variables you cannot control. And when your internal state is tied to external input, you are no longer grounded. You are responding, constantly adjusting, constantly recalibrating based on feedback. And most people do not realize how exhausting that is until they step outside of it, even briefly. Empaths, especially those who have developed a high level of self-awareness, tend to recognize this pattern earlier than most, not because they are immune to it, but because they can feel the shifts more intensely. They notice how a positive response can lift their mood, how a lack of response can create doubt, and how easily their emotional state can begin to mirror the reactions of others. And once you see that clearly, it becomes difficult to ignore, because you realize that your sense of self is being influenced by something that was never meant to define it. This realization often creates a turning point, a moment where a person begins to ask a different kind of question. Not how can I be seen more, but why do I need to be seen in order to feel secure? And that question is uncomfortable because it forces you to confront the possibility that some of your behaviors are not expressions of confidence, but attempts to maintain it. And once that awareness sets in, behavior starts to change. Not dramatically, but intentionally. Instead of posting to receive validation, a person may choose to share only when it feels aligned. Instead of measuring themselves through reaction, They begin to observe their own internal state. Instead of asking how something will be perceived, they begin to ask whether it reflects who they actually are. And this shift is subtle, but it is powerful, because it moves the center of control back inward. It replaces dependency with ownership, and ownership is where stability begins. The truth is, value does not increase just because it is seen more often. Something can be deeply meaningful, deeply developed, deeply real, and still remain largely invisible to the public. And in many cases, the most grounded people are not the most visible ones, because they are no longer organizing their lives around being noticed. They are organizing their lives around being aligned, and alignment does not always translate into visibility. Especially in a system that rewards constant output, this is why the absence of visibility should never be automatically interpreted as the absence of value, because that assumption is based on a flawed metric. It assumes that what is important must also be observable, and that is simply not true. Some of the most significant aspects of a person, their discipline, their integrity, their clarity, their emotional stability, develop in private, without audience, without applause, and often without recognition, but that does not make them any less real. If anything, it makes them more stable, because they are not dependent on being acknowledged in order to exist. There is also a level of psychological freedom that comes with this shift, because when you no longer need constant confirmation, you are no longer easily influenced by approval. You become less reactive, less concerned with how you are perceived, and more focused on how you actually live. And this changes everything, because instead of performing identity, you begin to inhabit it. You no longer feel the pressure to prove yourself in every moment. And that absence of pressure creates a kind of calm that most people rarely experience from the outside. This can look like withdrawal, like disengagement, like a lack of presence, but in reality, it is often the opposite. It is a deeper form of presence, one that is not split between living and being observed, one that does not require constant feedback to remain stable, and one that is not easily disrupted by the absence of attention. And this is why many empaths become more private over time, not because they have less to offer, but because they have learned that what they offer does not need to be constantly displayed in order to have value. And once you understand this, the entire equation changes, because you stop asking why someone is not visible, and you start asking whether visibility was ever a reliable indicator of value to begin with. And in most cases, the answer is no. It never was. It was simply the most convenient illusion to believe in. One of the most misunderstood behaviors in modern culture is privacy, because it is almost always interpreted through the wrong lens. When someone shares less, reveals less, or keeps parts of their life out of public view, the immediate assumption is that they are hiding, that they are afraid, that they are withdrawing from connection. But that interpretation misses something fundamental. Privacy is not always about avoidance. In many cases, it is about control, about choosing what is exposed and what is protected. And that distinction changes everything. When you share something publicly, whether it is a photo, a thought, or a moment from your life, it does not remain yours in the same way. It becomes subject to interpretation. And interpretation is never neutral. Every person who sees it filters it through their own beliefs, insecurities, experiences, and intentions. Some will respond with admiration, some with comparison, some with silent judgment, some with curiosity, and some with motives that are not immediately visible. And while most people are willing to accept that exchange as normal, empaths tend to feel the weight of it more directly, as if every exposure carries an unseen cost. Hughes often emphasizes that awareness changes behavior, and once a person becomes aware of how exposure invites interpretation, they begin to approach sharing differently, not out of fear, but out of discernment, because they realize that visibility is not just about being seen, it is about being perceived, and perception is something you cannot fully control once it leaves your hands. And for someone who values authenticity and internal stability, that lack of control becomes significant. This is where privacy shifts from something passive into something strategic. It is no longer about avoiding attention. It is about managing access, deciding who gets to see certain parts of you, when they get to see them, and in what context. And that is not weakness. That is structure. Because without structure, exposure becomes random, and random exposure often leads to unnecessary complications, misunderstandings, and emotional residue that accumulates over time. Many empaths learn this through experience rather than theory. They start out open, sharing freely, trusting easily, assuming that others will interpret their openness with the same sincerity they feel, but reality does not always respond that way. Sometimes openness attracts projection. Sometimes it invites intrusion. Sometimes it becomes material for gossip or leverage, and after enough of these experiences, something shifts, not in their capacity to connect, but in their willingness to expose without intention. At that point, privacy becomes a boundary, and boundaries are one of the clearest indicators of emotional maturity, because a boundary is not a wall. It does not exist to isolate. It exists to preserve. It defines where you end and where others begin. It determines what is accessible and what is not. And without it, a person becomes overly permeable, constantly influenced, constantly affected, constantly adjusting to external input in ways that erode stability over time. The problem is that many people have been conditioned to associate openness with virtue, to believe that sharing everything is a sign of authenticity, and that holding back is a sign of insecurity. But authenticity without boundaries is not authenticity. It is exposure without filter. And exposure without filter often leads to consequences that are misunderstood until they accumulate, because not every audience is capable of receiving what is shared in a way that is respectful or constructive. Empaths, especially those who have developed through difficult experiences, begin to understand this at a deeper level. They realize that access should not be automatic, that just because someone can see you does not mean they should cast a relay, and that not every part of your life needs to be available for public consumption. And this realization leads to a more selective approach, not cold, not distant, but intentional, where sharing becomes a choice rather than a reflex. There is also an energetic component to this. Even if you choose to interpret it purely psychologically, being seen by many people creates a kind of mental and emotional load, because each interaction leaves a trace. Each perception adds a layer, and over time, those layers can create a sense of heaviness, especially for individuals who process social information deeply. And privacy, in this sense, becomes a way to reduce that load, to limit unnecessary input, and to maintain a clearer internal state. From the outside, this can easily be misread People may see less sharing and assume disconnection. They may interpret selectivity as secrecy or restraint as distance. But what they are often observing is discipline, the ability to choose what is revealed and what is reserved. And that ability is not common because it requires self-awareness, confidence, and a willingness to go against cultural expectations that reward constant visibility. Ultimately, privacy is not about keeping others out for the sake of exclusion. It is about keeping yourself intact. It is about recognizing that your time, your energy, and your identity have value, and that value does not increase simply by being exposed to more people. In fact, in many cases, it is preserved by being shared less carelessly. And once a person understands that, privacy stops feeling like something they need to justify and starts feeling like something they choose deliberately, and that is where the misunderstanding ends and the clarity begins. Because when privacy is seen as a boundary rather than a defense, it no longer looks like fear. It looks like self-respect. It looks like structure. And most importantly, it looks like someone who understands that not everything meaningful needs to be made visible in order to remain real. There is a quiet shift that happens in people who begin to value depth over display, and once it happens, it becomes very difficult to go back because you start to notice something most people overlook: the difference between living a moment and presenting it. And at first that difference seems small, almost insignificant. But the more aware you become, the more obvious it is. Because these are not just two ways of behaving. They are two completely different ways of experiencing reality. Performance asks a simple question: how will this look? How will this be received? How will others interpret what I am about to show? And once that question enters your mind, something subtle changes. Your attention splits. Part of you is still inside the moment, but another part has stepped outside of it, observing, adjusting, preparing it for an audience. And that split, even if it is brief, changes the quality of the experience because you are no longer fully there. You are partially managing perception. Presence asks a different question: what am I actually experiencing right now? What does this feel like without an audience? Without interpretation? Without the need to capture or convert it into something shareable? And when you operate from that place, your attention remains intact. It is not divided. It is not filtered. It is fully invested in the moment itself. And that creates a level of depth that cannot be replicated when you are simultaneously trying to document or present what is happening. Hughes often talks about attention as one of the most valuable resources a person has. Because where attention goes, behavior follows, and where behavior goes, identity forms. And if your attention is consistently redirected outward toward how something will appear, then your experience of life becomes shaped by that outward focus, not by the internal reality of the moment. And over time, this creates a subtle but powerful shift. You begin to experience life through the lens of presentation rather than participation. Empaths tend to feel this shift more intensely than most, not because they are trying to avoid the world, but because they are more sensitive to the quality of their own attention. They notice when it is fragmented, when it is diluted, when it is pulled away from the moment by the anticipation of being seen, and that awareness creates discomfort, not dramatic, but persiste, a sense that something is being lost every time a moment is turned into content. This is why many empaths begin to resist the impulse to document everything, not out of rejection, but out of preference. They begin to value the unrecorded moment, the conversation that exists only between two people, the experience that does not need validation to feel complete, the memory that belongs entirely to them. And this preference is often misunderstood because, in a culture where sharing is normalized, choosing not to share can look like disengagement, when in reality it is often a deeper form of engagement. The more a person moves toward presence, the less they feel the need to convert experience into proof, because the experience itself becomes enough. It does not require an audience to confirm its significance. It does not need to be framed or curated to feel real. And this creates a kind of freedom that is difficult to explain to someone who is still operating in performance mode. Because performance always carries a subtle pressure. The pressure to maintain an image, to meet expectations, to stay consistent with how you have been perceived before. Over time, that pressure can become exhausting, even if it is not consciously acknowledged, because it requires constant awareness of how you are being seen, constant adjustment of how you present yourself, and constant anticipation of how others will respond. And for empaths, who already process emotional and social information deeply, that additional layer becomes heavy, not immediately overwhelming, but cumulatively draining. There is also something else that begins to emerge when a person fully embraces presence. They start to notice that some of the most meaningful moments lose something when they are shared too quickly. The quietness disappears. The intimacy shifts. The focus changes. And what was once a direct experience becomes a mediated one, shaped by reactions, comments, and interpretations that were never part of the original moment. And once you see that clearly, you begin to protect certain experiences, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for their original form. This does not mean empaths never share. It means they share differently. They are more selective, more intentional, and less attached to how what they share will be received, because their primary relationship is no longer with the audience. It is with the experience itself. And that shift is subtle, but it is powerful, because it redefines what matters. It moves value away from visibility and back toward authenticity. From the outside, this can look like absence, like someone is not participating in the same way as everyone else. But internally, it is often the opposite. It is a deeper participation, one that is not divided by the need to perform, one that is not shaped by the expectation of response, and one that allows a person to be fully immersed in their own life without constantly stepping outside of it to observe how it might appear. And this is where the real distinction becomes clear. A person who is constantly performing may appear more present, but they are often less connected to the moment itself. While a person who chooses presence over performance may appear less visible, but they are often experiencing life more fully. And once you understand that, the idea of constant visibility starts to lose its appeal, because you realize that being seen is not the same as being there. And for many empaths, being there is what they value most. There is a stage in the life of many empaths that people rarely talk about, because from the outside it looks like a personality change, but from the inside it feels like an awakening. And that stage usually comes after a series of experiences that are difficult to ignore, moments where openness was met with misunderstanding, where trust was met with manipulation, where honesty was used as leverage. And at first these experiences are confusing, because they do not match the empath's internal model of how connection is supposed to work. They assume sincerity will be met with sincerity, but reality does not always follow that pattern. Early on, many empaths operate with very few filters. They share easily. They explain themselves fully. They give people access quickly, not because they are naive, but because they are oriented toward connection. They believe that openness creates closeness. And sometimes it does, but sometimes it creates something else entirely. It creates opportunity for projection, for misinterpretation, for people who are more interested in extracting than understanding. And these moments leave an impression, not always immediately, but over time they accumulate. Hughes often emphasizes that behavior is shaped by repeated outcomes, not isolated events. And when a person repeatedly experiences negative consequences from a certain behavior, that behavior begins to change, not out of theory, but out of necessity. And this is exactly what happens with empaths. After enough experiences where openness leads to discomfort or harm, something begins to shift internally, not in their capacity to care, but in their willingness to expose without evaluation. At first, the change is subtle. They might hesitate before sharing something personal. They might notice who asks questions and why. They might start paying attention to patterns they previously ignored. Who listens and who interrupts, who respects boundaries and who tests them, who shows consistency and who only shows interest when it benefits them. And these observations begin to form a kind of internal filter, not rigid, not closed, but selective. And this selectivity is the beginning of discernment. Discernment is often misunderstood. People confuse it with distrust or defensiveness, but it is neither. It is the ability to differentiate, to recognize that not every person, not every environment, and not every moment is equally safe for openness. And once that realization becomes clear, behavior naturally adjusts, not dramatically, but intentionally. A person becomes more aware of where they place their energy, more thoughtful about what they reveal, and more comfortable with withholding when something does not feel aligned. This is the point where many outsiders misinterpret what they are seeing. They notice that the empath is sharing less, explaining less, exposing less, and they assume something negative, that the person has become closed off, guarded, or distant. But what they are actually witnessing is refinement, a movement away from indiscriminate openness toward intentional access. And that movement is not a loss. It is a gain because it protects what was previously given away too easily. There is also a deeper psychological shift happening beneath the surface. The empath begins to recognize that not all attention is care, not all curiosity is genuine, and not all connection is safe. And this recognition changes how they interpret behavior. They no longer take interest at face value. They look at consistency, at actions over time, at how someone responds when boundaries are introduced. And this creates a more accurate map of who they are interacting with. A map that is based on evidence rather than assumption. With this awareness, openness becomes conditional, not in a manipulative way, but in a grounded way. It is no longer automatic. It is earned, not through performance, but through consistency, respect, and alignment. And this shift can feel uncomfortable at first, especially for someone who is used to giving freely, because it requires saying no. It requires holding back. It requires tolerating the possibility that not everyone will understand or approve. But over time, It becomes natural because the benefits are clear. Less confusion, less emotional drain, less exposure to unnecessary conflict. Chase Hughes would describe this as adaptive behavior, a response that increases efficiency and reduces risk based on previous experience. And while it may look like withdrawal, to someone who is not aware of the context, it is actually a form of intelligence, the ability to learn from patterns and adjust accordingly. And in many ways, this is one of the most important developments in an empath's life, because it allows them to maintain their capacity for connection without constantly placing themselves in situations that deplete them. Another important aspect of this stage is that the empath begins to detach from the need to explain themselves to everyone. They realize that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected, not every assumption needs to be challenged, and not every relationship needs to be maintained. And this detachment is not indifference. It is prioritization. A recognition that energy is limited and should be directed where it is most respected and most reciprocated. Over time, this creates a new pattern of behavior, one that is quieter, more selective, and often less visible, but also more stable, because it is built on clarity rather than impulse. And while some people may interpret this as a loss of openness, the reality is that it is a more sustainable form of openness, one that does not require constant recovery from overexposure. And this is where the true nature of the change becomes clear. The empath has not become less capable of connection. They have become more capable of choosing it. They have not lost their willingness to share. They have refined it. And that refinement is what allows them to protect their energy, their identity, and their sense of self in a way that was not possible before, because now they understand something they did not fully understand before. That access is not something to be given automatically. It is something to be granted intentionally, and that intention is what transforms openness into discernment. There is a point in a person's development where silence stops being something they feel the need to explain and starts becoming something they choose deliberately. And this is where most people misread what they are seeing. Because from the outside, less visibility often looks like withdrawal, like distance, like a loss of confidence. But internally, it can represent something much more stable, something that is not driven by fear, but by clarity, a recognition that not everything needs to be shared, not every thought needs to be expressed, and not every part of the self belongs in public view. This is where self-respect begins to take a more visible form, not through assertion, not through dominance, but through restraint, through the ability to decide what is given and what is kept. And that ability is not as simple as it seems, because it requires a person to step outside of a system that constantly rewards exposure, that encourages constant sharing, constant visibility, constant engagement, and instead operate from a different standard, one that is internally defined rather than externally reinforced. Chase Hughes often frames power in terms of control over one's own behavior, not control over others. And when you look at it through that lens, the ability to remain selective in a culture that pressures you to be constantly accessible is a form of power, because it means your actions are not being dictated by expectation. They are being guided by intention. And intention is what separates reactive behavior from conscious behavior. For many empaths, this stage does not come easily. It is built over time, often through experiences that force them to reconsider how much of themselves they make available. They begin to see patterns where openness was not respected, where vulnerability was misunderstood, where access was taken for granted, and instead of continuing to repeat those patterns, they adjust, not by closing themselves off completely, but by redefining the conditions under which they open. This is where the concept of sovereignty becomes relevant, because sovereignty is not about isolation. It is about ownership, the understanding that your identity, your time, and your energy belong to you first, not to the expectations of others, not to the demands of an audience, and not to the systems that benefit from your constant participation. And once a person internalizes that, their behavior begins to reflect it in subtle but powerful ways. They stop over-explaining themselves to people who are not committed to understanding. They stop offering personal access to those who have not demonstrated respect for it. They stop placing themselves in environments where they feel the need to perform in order to be accepted. And these changes may appear small from the outside, but collectively they represent a shift in orientation from seeking approval to maintaining alignment, from being defined by perception to being grounded in self-definition. There is also a noticeable change in how they relate to attention itself. Attention loses a grip. It no longer functions as a primary source of validation. It becomes secondary, optional, something that can be engaged with or ignored depending on context. And this detachment is often what confuses others the most, because people who are not dependent on attention are difficult to predict, difficult to influence, and difficult to categorize. They do not respond in the expected ways. They are not easily pulled into comparison, and they are not motivated by the same signals that drive most behavior in highly visible environments. From a behavioral perspective, this makes them more stable, because their internal state is not constantly fluctuating based on external input. They are less reactive, less affected by praise or criticism, and more consistent in how they show up across different situations. And consistency, especially when it is not dependent on feedback, is one of the clearest indicators of internal alignment. This is why mature silence often carries a different quality. It is not empty. It is not uncertain. It has weight, because it is backed by decisions that have already been made, boundaries that have already been defined, and values that have already been clarified. And that kind of silence does not seek to be filled. It exists as it is, without the need to justify itself to anyone observing it. At the same time, this does not mean disengagement from life or from people. It means engagement on different terms, more intentional, more selective, and more aligned with what actually matters. Connections become fewer but deeper. Interactions become more meaningful because they are not driven by obligation or expectation, but by genuine interest and mutual respect. And this creates a different kind of experience, one that is less visible, but often more fulfilling. And this is where the misunderstanding reaches its peak, because what looks like absence is often presence in a different form. What looks like distance is often discernment, and what looks like silence is often self-possession, the ability to exist without constantly signaling that existence to others. And that ability is rare, because it requires a person to detach from the need to be acknowledged in order to feel real. Ultimately, self-respect and sovereignty show up in behavior, not in declarations. They are reflected in what a person chooses not to do, as much as in what they choose to do, in what they withhold as much as in what they reveal, and in a world that constantly encourages exposure. The decision to remain selective becomes a quiet form of resistance, not against others, but against the unconscious patterns that most people follow without question. And once you see this clearly, the narrative changes, because the person who shares less is no longer someone to be questioned or analyzed. They are someone who has likely reached a point where their value is no longer tied to visibility, where their identity is no longer shaped by reaction, and where their presence does not require constant confirmation. And that is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that they have stepped into something far more stable, a sense of self that is not dependent on being seen, and that is where real freedom begins.